Good morning again. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I'm Cal Van Singel. I'm the host here at Cal's Corner, and we are already on episode 13. And I have a very special friend, a great friend of mine, and somebody I've been looking forward to getting on the podcast since I've kind of dreamed of this. And his name is the one and only John Collier. And John comes to us from Grand Rapids. So welcome.
Thanks, Cal. I'm glad to be here today.
As I say, you're my next victim.
Yeah. Well, somehow I've been looking forward to it.
Yeah. John has an incredible story, incredible testimony, and he's kind of you have done a lot of things in your life.
Yeah.
Lived your life at the top of the mountain, and then kind of in the bottom of the valley.
Yeah.
So let's kind of get started with that. So, John, tell us about the early years of John Collier.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan area. I lived in the city all my elementary school years. My parents met when they were really young. My mother grew up in the Catholic faith and strict upbringing, Polish immigrants, my grandparents. And so she met my father probably around 15, 16 years of age. Mm-hmm. My father was a high school dropout, didn't have a big skill set, but he was crazy about cars. And he was kind of a other side of the track kid who basically got into fights and things like that. And didn't have a big value system from what I can recall, but they got pregnant very early. And my mom was about 16. And in those days, if you got pregnant early, you could be put in a home and your baby given for adoption. Mm-hmm. And my grandparents at that time actually had planned that. And my mother ran away, married my father so she could keep me.
Okay.
Bless her heart. And so that's kind of how life started for us. It wasn't easy. I mean, my mother barely turned 17 when I came along. I have a father that's 3 years older. I think he worked in a garage maybe or something like that. But the early years got going, and I had a sister that was born. And but by the age of 3, a lot of things started to kind of come to life about my father. My father was very, well, the adjectives I have for him were not good. My father was basically a womanizer. He abused alcohol. He abused drugs. He used people. He lied to people. He was a thief. He was a lot of things. And the thing that really always mattered to me, though, was as a boy, I loved my dad. I didn't look at my dad as good or bad. I loved my dad, and I longed for that father relationship. And that all changed about the age of 3 when I saw my father beat my mother for the first time. And she was protecting my sister and I. And that continued, that kind of violence continued through the marriage till I was about 8 years old. And so I had a very unstable childhood. I had a dad that I loved and longed to have his attention, but I could never get that. Mm-hmm. And so every year growing up in Grand Rapids, I think I went to 7 or 8 different elementary schools in the Grand Rapids area. And so we had to move. Every year we moved. And so by the time I was about 8 years old, my parents got divorced. My mother moved us away from the city because my father was very controlling. He would follow us. He would steal from us. So she got us out of town, took us to Traverse City, Michigan. And that was about probably, I think, I was just finishing elementary school, headed to Traverse City, Michigan with my mother and my sister. And then life seemed to be okay for a year or two. Okay. And mom found a man that she thought would be a good father for us. Mm-hmm. And she got married again. And that went south because this man got violent. And so, as a kid who was really confused, no male figure in his life, I began to rebel and I began to run away. Of course, my mother was in separation now in her second marriage. And by then, I was really incorrigible. And so I ran away twice within a short period of time after my mother separated from her second marriage. And part of that I talk about, one of the stories I tell is, I was so desperate that I didn't feel safe at home. I would do anything to get away. And I ran away. I got a bus ticket and ran away. I was gone for a while. And then I rolled my mother's car out of the driveway, 13 years old, at 2 a.m. and stole her car and drove it all the way from Grand Rapids to Traverse City, Michigan. And as a young boy, 12 years, I was 12. It was actually 12. And as a young boy, not knowing where he's going in the future, but only knowing where I felt safe once, I just headed in that direction. And that morning, I felt a knock on the window after I had parked behind a church overnight to get some sleep. And I woke up and looked up through the window, and there's a badge staring me in the face. And it was a police officer from Traverse City, Michigan. And I rolled the window down and talked to the officer, and he was really kind to me. And I didn't feel like a criminal or anything that day. That officer took me back to Traverse City Police Station, and they had to call my mother to come get her car. And I was in custody all day, but that officer spent the day with me. And he was the first man in my life that I ever met that actually cared about me for no reason. I have no idea, but that attention I got from that police officer that day was going to transform my life and send me on a new trajectory, because I didn't have a father. And all of a sudden, a man showed up in my life who cared about me, and he was wearing a badge. And that man represented something that I didn't recognize in anyone, especially my father. And I wanted to be like that. And so after that, I was sent back to Grand Rapids, Kent County, Michigan. That's where my mother had moved to. I was placed in a juvenile facility for runaways, Kent County Juvenile Court, and I didn't want to go home again. The courts and the probation department, they really wanted to get me back in my home, but I wouldn't do that. And so I just pushed back on that. And I said, well, if you send me, I'm going to run away again. And so they thought, well, as a young kid, I knew there was this thing called foster care.
Yeah.
And I said to my probation officer, here I am, 12 years old, and I'm the guy saying I want to go to be in a foster home, which is totally backwards, because kids should be with their families. And so I went into foster care. I ended up visiting with this family. I was a school teacher and his wife. And we really connected for some reason. And he represented a lot of things to me that I really loved. He was a man of integrity. He was a school teacher. He was a coach in sports. He taught me how to play golf, how to roll a bowling ball, how to do a lot of things. Took me hunting and fishing, things my own father never, ever did with me. And so I really reveled in that, and I excelled it, and especially in sports. So I ended up living in foster care all the way through high school. And so we got up to that point in my life where now my mother's living in Kent County. I'm not living with my mother, but I'm in a foster care home out in Lowell, Michigan. And the system, the justice system, they wanted me to reintegrate, of course, my relationship with my mother and see me. Eventually, the goal was for me to go home. But I'll tell you that I ended up living in that foster care home for the rest of my education through junior high and all the way through high school. And so that became something very solid for me, a good foundation. My mother saw that, and she allowed it to continue because she loved me so much. So my mother sacrificed a lot for me because she cared so much.
Did you get to see your mom quite a bit through
those
years?
Not at first. Okay. I'm glad you asked that, Cal, because what happened was I would do monthly visits with my mother. And it would be not necessarily a whole weekend, but I would see her for part of a day. And eventually that grew to where I'd do an overnight maybe with her. And then by the time I'm about 15 and in high school, my mom wanted me to go to church with her. And so I didn't want anything to do with church, but I said, okay, Mom, I'll go to church. I was becoming the obedient son, right? Well, my mother had a major transformation in her life. She made a life-altering decision to give her life to Jesus Christ. And I was about 15 at that time. And she she shared with me the impact of Christ on her life. And then she started talking to me about God and saying, God has a plan for your life. Well, John had a plan for his life too, but he wanted to do his plan. He didn't want to do mom's plan. And, I was the obedient son, and I would listen to this encouragement I would get from my mother. And so she began to pray for me during those years. Well, in my high school years, as I'm living in foster care, I had not seen my real father for some years now. And as I went through high school, I tried to initiate, and I did initiate contact with my real father, and I would see him now and then. But my father had been in and out of jail a few times, had already been to prison once. And so he was never really there for me unless it was convenient for him. But I still loved my dad.
Yeah.
And as a young boy growing up, I still longed for that. I wanted that approval. I was an overachiever in school. So I was always trying to get attention. I figured if I could be good, then I could get approval. And so as I went through high school, I accelerated academically. I accelerated in sports. I got positive reinforcement, and attention. And so for me, I became an overachiever, and I figured if I can be perfect, then people will like me, right? Yeah. And that's the pattern I followed. But it was also through those years of being separated from my real dad and really not ever knowing who he was that I began to hate the man he was. And he represented everything I was against. Excuse me. And so what I began to do is, of course, pursue my future. And I already knew what I wanted to do when I completed high school. I wanted to go to college. I wanted to become a policeman, that policeman who paid attention to me as a young man or a young boy. It never left my mind, and I wanted to be like him. And so I knew all the way through high school what I was going to do, where I was going to go. And I was going to become a police officer, and I was going to become the best. And I was not only going to be the best, I wanted to be the cream of the crop. Yeah. And so I got done with high school. I graduated, and then I went on to Grand Valley State University to play football, and then also to pursue criminal justice. And so I studied criminal justice. And a couple of years into college, I actually got a job working at the same juvenile court I was in as a kid as a runaway. And so I got an opportunity to work there and actually relate to other kids who had gone through a lot of the same things I had gone through. And I did that for a few years, all the way up to the end of college. I took the entrance exams for the Michigan State Police and the Indiana State Police at that time. And then I got accepted and called to Indiana. And Michigan wasn't hiring at the time. So I went to Indiana. And in 1980, fall of 1980, I attended the 40th recruit class of the Indiana State Police in Plainfield, Indiana. I completed school. I graduated from the academy. I received my first appointment at Evansville, Indiana, which at the time I had no idea where Evansville, Indiana was. And I found out it was right across the river from Ohio.
Ohio. Yeah.
Henderson, or Ohio on one side, Kentucky. No, it was Henderson, Kentucky on the other side. And then you've got Illinois. So you're out in the middle of nowhere. And I went to Evansville, Indiana, and began my career as an Indiana State Trooper. Awesome. During this process, my real dad, of course, he would drop in and out of my life. I lost contact with him. He ended up in prison again. Matter of fact, the day I had to go before the Indiana State Police Board and the superintendent of the Indiana State Police, he was in prison again. And when I went up in full dress uniform, and all the cadets go through this before they graduate, they have to go before the board. You get drilled with a lot of questions. You got a lot of brass uniforms sitting in front of you and shirts and ties, and you're standing there at attention. And the superintendent of the state police at that time brought up my father. And they knew about my father. They knew he was in prison. And I hated my father at that time. By then, I just felt in my heart, I hate this man. I want nothing to do with him. And And I was asked the question, you know, if your father continues this kind of criminal behavior when he gets out of the prison system, what's your response going to be? And my response was, he's going down. And I meant it. And the superintendent of the state police looked at me and he said, "You're a self-made man."
Which you are.
Yeah. And I believed it in my heart. I believed everything I had accomplished was due to just John doing what John does. John worked hard to get here, and John's responsible for getting to where he's at. And so I took that credit when he called me a self-made man, and I just kind of patted myself on the back. Now you got to realize also that at this time in my life, you know, I'm not following God. I don't know God. I've got a mom that's praying for me, but John's doing his thing because John wants to get to the top. And so I graduated from Recruit Academy and went on, got sworn in, and went to Evansville, Indiana. And then I began my career as an Indiana State Trooper. So for the first 2 to 3 years of my career, I got noticed, and I accelerated, and I overachieved by the number of arrests I was making monthly as a state trooper, and significant number of felony arrests I was also making. And I got noticed. And so by the time I had been with the state police only 2 to 3 years as a young state trooper, I was already appointed or assigned to the governor's detail. And the governor at that time in Indiana was a guy named Bob Orr. And he lived in Evansville, Indiana. And when he would come into town from the capital, I was assigned to his team. And most of the time I was his driver. So I would go to the airport, to the hangar where the governor would fly in, and I'd be there to pick him up. I'll spit and shine, and I would take him wherever he wanted to go or take him home. I would accompany him on public functions too. I'd be the guy in the dark suit behind him. And I was really proud of that. I thought, wow, I can't believe that. I'm only 24, 25 years old. I'm a bodyguard for the governor. Wow, I'm a real hotshot, And we're going to do more things, and we're going to put more bad guys away. And so I began to accumulate a lot of commendations, awards, and I got noticed. And I did that for probably a year or two as I remained in Evansville. And then I decided that at some point I wanted to get closer to my family in Michigan. So I put in a transfer to get up in northern Indiana. And I went to South Bend area. I found a trooper. We just kind of swapped posts. We traded. And I went to South Bend, Indiana, which was just a couple hours from Grand Rapids area, my home. And by then, I'm riding pretty high, doing well in my career. I'm moving to South Bend, and then now I'm all of a sudden I'm working Granger, Indiana, which is the Indiana toll road. So you got 150 miles of tollway one way and 150 miles the other. And we worked zones. Back in those days, they split the troopers into 4 zones, so you cover an area. And I began continue my career there in South Bend, and I continued to make a lot of arrests, more accommodations and letters and things like that. And then about 5 years into my career, I'm doing really well and well established. And now I'm a seasoned state trooper. And then I get a call one day out of the blue from Michigan. And guess who it is? It was my real dad. My dad called me. And I had not talked to my dad in a long time. Matter of fact, he had just gotten out of prison his 3rd time. And, my father represented everything that I hated. But deep in my heart, there was still a little boy that loved his dad and longed for his dad's approval. And I think I'd been waiting all my life and hoping to hear the words from my dad that you've got what it takes to be a man, that I'm proud of you, that you've done well. And those were the things I was hoping to hear. And so my father called me after having gotten out of prison a 3rd time. And he actually wanted to come visit me in Indiana. So I said, come on down. And so he came on down. And he came and spent a weekend with me. And I took him out to drive with me a couple of times. And we did some traffic stops. And he kind of got to see what the life of a trooper looks like. And then, we went back to my place. And before the weekend ended, I had that conversation with him. And he said, He said, "I'm proud of you."
Mhm.
And, I'd been waiting all my life to hear that from him, Cal. But when he said it, I didn't believe it because my father was never honest with me about anything. He would always lie and manipulate to get what he wanted. And that after my father left that day, even though I thought I'd heard the words I've been waiting for all my life, it didn't change anything. But something changed inside of me, I noticed. Because one of the things I had carried all those years was a lot of complex childhood trauma. In the later years, which I'll talk about, I was diagnosed with PTSD from all the violence and everything else. My father was extremely controlling. I mean, being in the same room as a little boy, loved my dad, but I was terribly afraid of him too. And that effect or that power he seemed to have over me as a child, it came back on that visit when he came to visit me. And I can only tell you, it was like something turned a key inside of me, and I began to feel emotions based on the trauma I had experienced in my life.
Okay.
I didn't know how to deal with it.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to ask for help because I was a cop.
Yeah.
I didn't want to ask for help. I didn't want to show that I was weak or I needed help.
Yeah.
So what did I do? I started to medicate my pain. And I would go home after work at night and I would start drinking. And then as the weeks went on, I would drink more. And then that became a routine for me. And here I am trying to kill this pain I've got inside that I don't know what's going on. And then I start drugging. And I continue to drug. And by that time, I was in really bad shape as far as I was not thinking clearly. I had lost the only identity I had ever wanted, to be a police officer. That self-made man, that self-made identity.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't even know who I was, because now the one thing I lived for, I'm abusing. And I started doing things completely contrary to what my belief system is. And so by then, I'm taking drugs now. And as time went on, I started to roll drug dealers, take their drugs and their money.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, I'm doing super petty, stupid stuff. It's almost like I was intentionally self-destructing. And that's what I was doing. I was self-destructing. And it caught up, and an internal investigation began. And once that investigation began, of course, I ended up having to get an attorney. And I ended up resigning from the state police, the Indiana State Police, in disgrace. And so now I'm totally messed up. And by then I'm hooked on cocaine now. Mm-hmm. And I'm not even a policeman anymore, and I'm hooked on cocaine, and I'm walking around carrying a gun on.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Not to interrupt you, but I want to go back to something before we get further in the story. When you started to spiral down, didn't anybody notice at your post, your command? Was there nobody there that noticed? And back then, so it probably in the late 80s, there was probably no counseling like there is now.
Yeah.
So there was probably, your command structure didn't notice that you were struggling?
No.
And there was really no one for you to talk to. You didn't have anybody in your life. Your foster dad was up in Lowell.
I had one man in my life at that time for a while, and it's interesting because he was a believer and he was a state trooper.
Okay.
He was actually a roommate of mine at the academy, but he left the department after I came to South Bend, and we worked that post for about a year together. He left, and he got disgruntled because we were like the worst paid in the country at that time.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
And he just got tired of it and left. And so he was a good friend who would have been a good support for me, but he wasn't there.
Yeah.
And so I was pretty much alone by that time. And I didn't have a group of guys, or even one guy that I really trusted, to share what was going on inside of me.
Okay.
And I wished I did. But I did.
Much easier to go through life if you have that.
Yeah, and I didn't have that at that time. And so I went through trying to do life on my own.
Yeah. And
things began to self-destruct.
So continue on then with your story about, doing cocaine.
Yeah. So now I'm hooked on cocaine. There's an internal investigation going on my conduct with the state police. I had been doing some petty stuff too that that brought some charges against me, some misdemeanors for official misconduct and things like that. And so by then I come back to Michigan. I'm hooked on cocaine. I'm super angry at the whole world. And I'm blaming the whole world for all of my troubles. I'm looking at everybody else. And I figured by now I just like lost it. Didn't know who I was anymore. I had no destiny, no future, no purpose, no nothing. And so I come back to Michigan and I take the skills that I learned as a police officer and I start committing safe burglaries in Michigan. And so I go on a rampage in Michigan for the next few years, and I'm in and out of prison twice. And this is like a nightmare I felt like I created for myself. The self-made man created his own nightmare. And in December of 1991, I was in Traverse City, Michigan, and I was committing a burglary of a business. And that night, I had broken into a safe of an establishment, and a police officer showed up to just check the building from the county sheriff. And it was in Grand Traverse County, and right across the street was Leelanau County, I believe right on the border.
Yeah.
And it was one of those nights in December when it started to snow. An officer comes to check the building. I go out the other side of the building. He discovers a break-in and calls for backup. And before you know it, I'm being chased cross country by Leelanau, Grand Traverse County sheriffs, and the Michigan State Police. And so they wrapped me up. They caught me after about a half-hour pursuit and wrapped me up, took me into Grand Traverse. Of course, I refused to tell them anything about me. And by the next morning, everybody knew who I was. Here's this guy that's a former decorated state trooper. Here he is. What is going on? Who is this guy? And I tell you what, I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders, and I was ready to just end my life.
Yeah.
Because I felt the hatred of not just inmates in that, but other police officers, even the court people I had to deal with when I was in there. And, the next morning, a court officer came out to read charges to me. And he told me at that time what a worthless human being I was and how I deserved to spend the rest of my life in prison. And I believed every word he said. And at that time, my life was pretty much over because I'd been linked to safe burglaries in 2 other counties. So here I am looking at life in prison now. Safe burglary, safe breaking is a life offense in Michigan. I'm looking at life in prison now in two more counties besides Grand Traverse. And then I'm at the point where I'm just ready to end my life. I don't know who I am. I figure I must be a bad guy because I've been doing a lot of bad things. And I just didn't care anymore. And so I was ready to end my life. And I do remember the night that I was going to end my life. I had planned it out. I knew what I was going to do. And that night, a man showed up at my cell with a Bible. And who'd have thought? God sent somebody.
Yeah.
Well, I saw a man come into my cell. Isolation cell I was in. I saw the Bible. First thing I thought, of course, was I'm going to get this. You're going to hell. And, but I didn't get that at all. This man came up to my cell and he looked at me and he said, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "What?" And he said, "Are you okay?" I said, "No, I'm not okay." Well, that man was a man named Robert Hall. He was the jail chaplain. And something about that man, he didn't start preaching at me or anything, but something about that man caught my attention. He was the second man in my life who showed up in my life and cared about me for no reason at all. And he's full of love of Christ, and it kept me alive then. And he came back, and he came back again and again, and he didn't give up on me. And I didn't take my life while I was in this process, but I knew what I was facing.
Yeah.
But I knew I'd come to a place in my life, Cal, where if I continued to make these decisions in my life as I had in the past, I was either going to end up spending the rest of my life in prison or dead. And so after I was in that jail for 3 months, and a lot of soul searching, and also remembering the prayers of a mother who started praying for her son when he was 15. You know, I heard those little voices in the back of my head saying that God's got a plan for your life. And so I gave my life to Christ in Grand Traverse County Jail in March of 1992. And 6 months later, I was going to go to prison. And it was looking pretty bad for me. And I was expecting possibly spending the rest of my life in prison. And by the grace of God, I got a plea deal. And I was going to go away for 8 to 15 years. And it was going to be flat time. It's habitual. And so I was going to go away for a minimum of 8 years. And so I went away. They sent me to prison. And I didn't know what was going to happen. Here I am, a new believer in Christ. I'm very timid, not knowing what to do, not knowing what's going to happen, whether I'm going to live or die. But I knew at that time I'd given my life to Christ. I knew that I was on a new trajectory, and I knew I had a new purpose for living. And throughout my prison experience, those next 8 years, I say now that I needed that time, because it took God 8 years to work on John, to break down the man I was and to rebuild me in the man he wanted me to become. And throughout all my experience of traveling to several different prisons, I was moved around a lot. Oftentimes I was put in protective custody, whether I wanted it or not. So I spent about a year in isolation. And you know, it was during those times when God met me where I was, in a very dark and lonely place. And this chaplain, going back to this chaplain who came to me in the county jail, he became my mentor. As I went around the state to different prisons in the Michigan system, he and his wife would come and visit me. And it was really powerful, because the more they came to see me, the more I wanted to be like Christ. And another wonderful thing that happened, that was a particularly good thing, but another wonderful thing that happened was during my incarceration early on, God began to restore a relationship with my mother and I too. Because my mother was deeply hurt by my actions. And she was about to write me off. And she said something very profound in an interview that she did with the 700 Club. And she said God spoke to her and said that you're bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She said, but God says to her, to deny your son is to deny me.
Oh, yeah, that's deep.
Yeah. So it set us on a new trajectory. My mother came to see me. And the first time my mother came to see me was in a glass booth. I couldn't hug her. But I remember putting my hand up to the glass. You know, and my mom was doing the same thing. And I remember praying with her that day. From that day on, I had a relationship with my mother I'd never experienced in my whole life, knowing God on a more personal and deep level. And when she came to see me in prison, the purpose of our visit was not just a visit, it was really to experience Christ together. And that was life-changing for me. I'll tell you, during these years of incarceration, I never saw my real father. I never heard from him. I never talked to him on the phone. As far as I know, he could have been dead. I wouldn't have known it. But when I got out of prison, when I got to the end of my prison journey, I headed back to Grand Rapids, Michigan. The Department of Corrections sent me to what was called then a level 1 facility, minimum security, where it's like an out kind of you're in and out, you sign in and out, you go find a job, you go to work, you report back, you stay there, of course. You're under the supervision of the Department of Corrections. And it's pretty awesome that the place I went to at that time, the Michigan Department of Corrections Center in Grand Rapids, Michigan, is now it's now a ministry called Exodus. Put a plug in for them. And I know the director, he's become a friend, but I think God is wonderful for how he does things. And my journey began there. I went to live with my mom and my stepdad, and I began to go to Resurrection Life Church in Granville. I loved Wayne VanDyk and his teachings. He was a solid Bible teacher. So I gravitated to there, and which is where I met my wife. And so my life begins anew and differently. And I kind of know where I'm going. I decide I'm going to go back to college. I'm pursuing what I think is God's purpose for my life. And I really didn't care what I did as long as all I had was God.
Gotcha.
And so by then I'm living with my parents now. I'm on a tether because I'm still technically under the supervision of the DOC. And about a year goes by and the tether comes off and I'm paroled. And then one day I'm at church. I get invited to a singles group one night for something to do after church or after work. And that's where I met my wife. And so we began dating. And she had a daughter. She was divorced. And the three of us would meet up at church. That's how our dating began, a couple times a week. And so I began this new journey in a new life and exploring and seeing what God had for me. And it was during that time I just fell in love with her. Mm-hmm. And I asked her to marry me. And now I'm 43 years old, never been married my whole life. Didn't want anything to do with marriage after watching, what happened with my parents.
Yeah, gotcha.
But God, God changes your heart. He changes your wants and your want-nots. He changed my want-nots. Yeah. And so I met my wife, Lori, and we've been married 24, almost 25 years now. And God began to do more in me. And I had no idea what God had planned for me. Because after that period, what happened next was, my wife and I got married. We plugged into a really good church. We moved away north. We plugged into another Resurrection Life type church. And we were just experiencing a lot of God's goodness in our lives. Well, about 2 years after we're married, my wife and I go to an auto repair shop one day. And this is kind of a cool story because this is about my real dad again. My father's second marriage, he had I have some siblings. I have a couple of half brothers, actually 4 half brothers. And one of my half brothers runs an auto repair in Grand Rapids, Michigan, right off Chicago Drive. And I'm in his shop one day and I see this little guy over across the shop floor. He's about 5'6", and he's probably about 120 pounds soaking wet. It's my dad. Now, I hadn't seen my real dad in about 10 years. And the last time I saw him was from the back of a prison van as they were taking me away. And he never came to see me all those years. But this day I saw my dad. Here I am, full of love of Christ. And I run over this guy and I grab him and I start shaking his hand and hugging him. And I'm like, Dad, it's me. It's your son, John. And he's looking at me like, who the heck are you? And what? You're crazy and everything else. And I just kept hugging on him and saying, John, it's me, your son, John, Dad. You wouldn't believe what God has done in my life. And I've got so much to tell you. And he was just flabbergasted. Mm-hmm. My father was a con man his whole life. He always used people, and his attitude was, oh, no, I'm good. You don't have to pray for me. I don't need your prayers. Save them for somebody else. But I said, Dad, I'm going to start praying for you. So I started praying for my father. And I had forgiven my father. And, and all the anger and all the hatred and all these things I had been battling all these years, it was gone. God cleaned me up. He cleaned out my heart. And he filled me with something holy, the Holy Spirit, right? Yeah. So I'm loving on this man who didn't even recognize me. And I got to share this with a group of guys. And I said, that's because, 2 Corinthians 5:17 says that if any man be in Christ, he's a new creation. Behold, the old is gone. Everything has become new. And the man my father looked at that day was not the same son he had seen years before. He didn't recognize me. Mm-hmm. And I began to tell my father that God had a plan for his life too. Well, a couple of years go by and I'm still praying for my father, and my sister calls me one day. She says, I need to talk to you about our dad, our real dad. The long story short, he had been having dementia and it got bad and he had to go to a nursing home. And my father was really rough around the edges, old dropout, collar up, didn't like anybody. They'd send him to a nursing home and he'd cuss everyone out, try to pick fights in a nursing home. And he'd get kicked out. I didn't know you could get kicked out of a nursing home. And this happened a few times until one day my sister called me and said, he's at this place now. And I just felt prompted by God to go see my father. And I had no idea why, Cal. And, I picked a day to go see my dad, and I'm praying all the way there. And I don't even know what I'm going to say to my own dad. And I get to the nursing home, and I go to the desk, and I tell them, I'm here for Ben Piper. That was my dad's name. Mm-hmm. And they tell me his room number. And so I go to the room, and I can envision this. I'm standing at the door, and I see my father sitting in a chair over there. And I waited for a moment to see if he would know it was me. And he looked at me, and he said, John, I've been thinking about you. And I said, Dad, I've been thinking about you too. And I went over and I sat down, and I took my dad's hand. And I said, Dad, God sent me to see you today to tell you you're going to die. I said, Dad, if I died today, I know where I'm going to go. If you died today, I want you to know where you're going to go. The first time in my life, Cal, I prayed with my dad. And I led him to Christ that day. My dad being a con man, that was no con. It was the real thing. And I led my dad to Christ that day. And for the next 14 months of his life, I went back to that nursing home every week. And I would take my Bible, and I would read to my father, and I would pray for him. And during that time, my father expressed the desire to get baptized. And so that same week, we got it done. We took him to the church. And my half-brother and my sister, other family. And my father got up. He was very weak by then. He was probably about 80 pounds. And I had to carry him literally into the baptismal tank because he couldn't walk. But he had enough strength to talk about what God had done for him and to share his love for Christ, his newfound love for Christ. And I remember when he went under the water and came up, he came up as it's like a bright white light. It was a beautiful thing. And my dad, the first thing out of his mouth was, I feel like a new man. I said, you are, Dad, you're a new man. And from that day on, I got to be with my father and say some things to him that I really meant with all my heart. One of the most precious things that happened was, just in the days before my father passed, and we knew it wasn't going to be long, I got to sit by his bedside and hold his hand and look him in the eye as a son to a father and say to him, Dad, I'm so proud to be your son. And it was. And I remember he shook his head. And he was so glad, but my father went to eternity after that. And what's interesting about all this is I began to share my story about my experiences with my father. Mm-hmm. And I was involved in a lot of different things. I was a follower of Joyce Meyer Ministries. She impacted my life. Mm-hmm. And it was actually during those years, during that time with my father, when I had begun to read some of her materials, Battlefield of the Mind, which is an awesome book. If you're ever struggling with, if you're struggling emotionally, Battlefield of the Mind, yeah. Fantastic book. And it really helped me. This was before before I was diagnosed with PTSD. So that helped me on a whole new level. Mm-hmm. So much so, I wrote her an 8-page letter. And then I got a call like a year later that they wanted to fly me down to Fenton, Missouri for her television show. So I flew down there, and we did 2 shows on Battlefield of the Mind. And by then, I was thinking about writing a book. I'm only sorry I didn't bring a copy, but I was thinking about writing a book and sharing my story because I'd been doing some public speaking about my life and my father, and I'd been encouraged to write a book. And it was when I was in Fenton, Missouri, doing the Joyce Meyer show, that one of her writers actually was the third person to tell me, you need to write a book about this. So at the same time I'm down there, they're actually filming me to do an excerpt on my story they were going to take with them to do with other conferences nationwide. And it was during that time that I began to write my story, my book. And then, of course, my father had passed by then. I started to do some public speaking, and then we started Father's Love Ministries, which is the ministry I have today. And then I began to get more involved. 700 Club, they came along. We did some television stuff with 700 Club. My mom's a real star of that. And since then, we started doing men's ministry. I did a lot of public speaking, but it was probably about just a few years after that, Cal, when I began to experience some internal stuff. I started to have flashbacks from my childhood trauma in my police work. And something was definitely wrong. I wasn't responding to it well at first, but I did know something was wrong. And my wife was, I know she was really worried about it. And I was too. I was concerned because I was starting to check out and isolate again. And I also started to drink again. And then I went to several different doctors. I got some help. I was diagnosed with PTSD. And for 2 years, I saw a therapist every week. And I walked through a lot of the hell I experienced as a kid. But I came out of it better. And by the time I was freed from all that and I had recovered, I was prompted to also, I really wanted to see what I could do to help other first responders or former first responder and or military. I wanted to continue my healing and my recovery journey in a way that would help other men and women. And so in 2018, I partnered with a national organization called Reboot Recovery. And rebootrecovery.com, if people go there, they'll find that they have a recovery program for trauma for veterans, first responders, past, present, former, whatever, and even civilians. And so this was an opportunity for my wife and I to actually begin doing something together to help other people walk through their trauma journey and see them get healed. And so Reboot Recovery developed a 12-week program, and we became facilitators. We got trained up as leaders in the program, and we started doing that. And the first class we did was in person. And so we had first responders in our class. It was really interesting to do something like this. It was challenging because here I am leading this former decorated state trooper who was also a guy who ended up on the other side of the street. But God, restored my life and brought me to this ministry. And through that ministry, God not only has brought more healing into my own life, but we've seen marriages restored. We've seen other men and women get healed and continue to move forward in their lives for trauma recovery. And so that's been a big message for me too, to go out and get the word out, because a lot of people are experiencing trauma on different levels in the world we live in today. It's crazy, but there is something out there available for people now, and it doesn't cost money. It's a free program. It's funded. And so we try to get people involved. Reboot Recovery they do interviews basically. Well, they do classes, I should say. It's a 12-week program. We do them all over the country, in person and virtually. For a year, I took this past year off because we did a lot in the last years. But in a year, the years we were doing it, we did virtual classes with people all over the country, from Washington State, Arizona, Massachusetts, Florida. We had people all over the place that were coming together into our virtual classrooms. And it's really impacting because by the third week of the class, you're really getting to the hard stuff. And 80% of the people that go through Reboot Recovery actually graduate. They successfully complete the program, and many go on to actually become facilitators and leaders. And it's really it's a solid way to disciple other people, because we don't just go through trauma recovery. We go through when we get into our advanced courses, we get to the real biblical aspects of what God's word says about how we're to live our lives and how God can heal us and bring us to a place where we can recover from that. and we can be aware of what's happening, and we can recognize, things in our lives and triggers, and symptoms, and things like that. So we can identify trauma when it comes up, and then we can also equip people to not only learn about it, but identify it in their own lives and identify the triggers. And we give them mechanisms as well so that they can use the word of God to walk in strength and power and freedom.
Love it. Yeah.
And that's the way to go.
Awesome. Couple quick questions. We're starting to run out of time. Couple questions.
Yep.
Your foster father
Yeah.
was a big part of your life in junior high and high school.
Yeah.
Do you is he still alive, or do you have any contact with him?
He's not still alive, but I have had contact with him.
Okay.
Before he died, he would have passed away. I'm thinking he passed away 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay.
And I reached out to him. I had not seen him a long time. What's ironic is that when I completed high school, both my foster parents sat down with me to tell me they were getting divorced. And that kind of blew that family.
Oh.
It kind of caused a separation, because after I went to college, it wasn't like I was going to be coming home to my foster parents anymore. And so there was something broken there, and they got divorced. Well, after all these years, I wrote him a long letter. And he was still out in Lowell. He had become a principal, and then he retired from teaching and in school. And I wrote him like a 3-page letter. And I really wanted to thank him in depth as much as I could for giving me a home, for instilling a good value system into me, for teaching me what truth is and integrity and how to walk in that. My foster parents were not church-going people. They were good people.
Yeah.
But I wanted to reach out to him and share with him how God had changed me and changed my life, and thank him. And we had a reunion. I did get to see him in person, to thank him personally as well before he died. And so I was able to touch base with him.
Good job on that.
Thanks.
What about the chaplain from Traverse City?
So Chaplain Hall, that led me to Christ that day, he actually not only mentored me, but he married me and my wife.
Okay.
And he passed away in just a few years before I wrote my book. Miss him dearly, loved him to pieces, but I'll see him again in heaven.
Yes. Yep. And you still want to get this in there. You still, after 20 years or 25 years, you still go back to Traverse City, to that same jail.
I do.
At least once a year.
I do.
And speak to the inmates that are there.
I do. And this is coming up on my anniversary. I'll be going there in December to speak to the inmates, the men and the women. And the same jail I was in over 30-something years ago. And this will be my 25th year, I think, going back to share my story and hopefully give them the hope of Christ that'll change their lives.
Yep. And a lot of them will be in the same situation that you were in at one point.
Yeah.
And look where you are now.
Yeah.
When you said earlier you were a self-made man, you are on so many different levels.
Right.
Because you've had to overcome so much. A lot of them, like myself, I had parents that left me with an opportunity to be in the world's eye successful.
Yep.
My dad taught me how to fish and a little bit to hunt, but I had a father for 31 years, who was there. A lot of my buddies, I had fathers, for decades. One of my closest friends, he's 65. He just lost his dad.
Yeah.
Something you didn't have at all. So you are self-made. You're recently retired.
Yeah.
What's next?
Well, I'm really involved in some ministries besides Father's Love Ministries. I still do some public speaking. I spoke at a men's group in Detroit last night. Yep. But I also want to serve too. And I like to serve behind the scenes without being the guy out front. I like to be the hands and feet in the back.
Yeah.
And so there's a ministry called The Roadmap in Big Rapids area. And they have an event called The Return, which I got involved in going on my first return as a former first responder about 1.5 years ago. And it changed my life on a whole new level. And so if people go out to theroadmap.org, they can find out about this ministry. And if they want to find out more about me, they can go to flministry.net, flministry.net, and they can go to my website too, because I do share some of my story there. I talk about trauma, But the roadmap is something I'm involved in. I continue to be involved with Grace Explorations, speaking at their base camps. And then when opportunities come, I'll go to those as well. I spoke at a wild game dinner this year in Traverse City that was huge in February, and well over 1,000 people there, and a lot of salvations, decisions for Christ. God is so good.
Yeah.
So I can't wait to see what's next.
What's next? Awesome. So, well, John, I tell you what, you knocked it out of the park. Just wow. But it's just, I didn't have to say hardly anything, which was, more you, less me. That's what I told you in the beginning. But no, that was great. Any thoughts you want to leave us with?
Yeah, I think the biggest one I can do is, the biggest mistake I made in my life was trying to do life on my own.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something I speak to men about all the time, because there's so many of us hard-headed guys out there trying to do life on our own. The fact is, we can't do life on our own. We need others. And we need others for strength, for guidance. We need those friendships.
Yes.
And so my message is, don't try to do life on your own. It's a whole lot better when you're in the fellowship, and you're in the right group of people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my encouragement to people.
Okay, sounds good. Well, we're going to wrap this one up, episode 13, and I kind of fumbled right on the goal. I fumbled on the goal line coming right out of this, because there's a guy who's really important here to Cal's Corner, and that is one and only Billy Mann here, who's our engineer. And Billy started a business here about, a year and a half ago, called KLLB Media. And he's based right here in Whitehall, Michigan. And he's multi-gifted, multi-talented when it comes to all of this technical stuff. You give me a tractor, I'm probably your guy. But when it comes to doing all this stuff and the things that he does, he's just amazing at what he can do. So if you need some internet video streaming work done, just look up KLLB Media right here in Whitehall. Get a hold of me on my Facebook, and I can get you set up with Billy. And just want to thank Billy very much for all that you do. And he's really just becoming a lifeline here in Whitehall, Montague area. He does a lot of stuff behind the scenes. Just a blessing to so many people. So, Billy, thanks again. John Collier, thank you.
Thanks, Cal.
What an hour this has been, and I knew it would be. So, we will see you again soon for episode 14. But until then, thank you. Have a blessed day. We'll talk soon.